Welcome to Wickedly Judged, where we uncover the hidden flaws and shocking injustices in the legal system. I'm your host, Rebecca, and every week we'll dive deep into the stories of those wrongfully convicted, overlooked, or betrayed by a system designed to protect them. These aren't just tales of courtroom drama. They're real lives forever altered by corruption, bias, and human error. Together, we'll unravel the truth, challenge what we think we know, and ask the hard questions. How does this happen? Who's responsible? And what can be done for the wickedly judged? If you're ready to explore the darker side of justice, you've found your place. Let's begin. Today, we dive into the gripping case of Johnny Watkins, a man fighting to prove his innocence against the odds of a flawed legal system.
It's not about justice anymore. It's about a conviction rate.
Johnny Watkins was a 32-year-old Army veteran. He was a father, a son, a brother, and a friend. He was known in his community as hardworking and kind. But despite his reputation, investigators began to view him as their prime suspect. Why? The alleged evidence that they had was thin. There was no DNA, no murder weapon, no fingerprints, no clear motive. Yet law enforcement moved forward, determined to pin this crime on him. It is July 28, 2005, a warm summer night in Trenton, Ohio. This is the time of year where everyone loves to go camping, swimming, fishing, and just be outside. It was no different for Johnny, Caleb, Jake, and Billy. They all decided to go camping at the CG&E pond. Caleb and Billy had brought down a couple loads of firewood so that they would have enough to last a couple of nights. Jake and Johnny showed up later in the night with beer. This was supposed to be a quiet night by the fire, just chilling and hanging out. Little did they know that a few hours later, everyone's lives would forever be changed. Now, this pond was known as a place that people often went to. Lots of people were there that stayed during the summer months. A gentleman by the name of Steve pretty much lived there during the summer. The boys had seen him around a few times and decided that they would play a practical joke on him. They took his cooler of beer. Now, looking at the ages of the three boys involved, 16, 18, 19, one would think that maybe they were just playing a joke. However, it didn't come across to Steve that way, and he was upset that they would do that to him. Rumor had it that Steve vowed to get even with them, even if that meant tampering with their vehicles at the top of the hill. Johnny only found out what the three boys had done when they showed up at his house scared that Steve was going to hurt them for taking his beer. They were frantic, breathing heavily, scared. Johnny asked them what was wrong. They told him that they were lucky they didn't get shot, or worse, killed. That's when Jake told Johnny that Steve carried a gun, and he had seen it before. A few weeks later is when Johnny, Caleb, Jake, and Billy were camping out at their usual spot. Johnny, Caleb, and Billy were taking firewood down to the campsite earlier in the day, and that is when the two boys pointed out Steve to Johnny. Johnny walked the two boys over to where Steve was and made them apologize to him. Steve accepted their apology and thanked them for being man enough to admit their mistake. Steve was at the fire with Johnny and the boys later in the evening, and that is when Jake apologized for being so stupid and disrespectful to Steve. Now, all three boys had apologized, but for reasons we will never know, Steve did not accept Jake's apology. At After sitting around the fire for a while, Steve and Jake started arguing because Jake just couldn't let it go. He didn't understand why Steve wouldn't accept his apology. Steve decided it was time to leave, and he gets up and walks away from the fire and starts walking back up the hill. Jake gets up and is following him. At one point, Jake was in front of Steve, and Steve stopped walking. Jake turned around and was arguing with him again and ended up pushing Steve down. One can only imagine what was going through each of the guys' minds at this time. Steve stood back up, and him and Jake were face to face. At this time, Jake started yelling at Steve to get his hand out of his pocket. "Don't hurt me. What do you have in your pocket, Steve? Are you pulling a gun on me?" From all accounts, the boys thought that Jake feared what was going to happen to him. That is when Johnny jumped up from the fire, followed by Caleb, and both took off to where Steve and Jake were at. Johnny had a small log in his hand for protection, and Caleb had a knife. Johnny and Caleb take off running to where Steve and Jake are. Time was of the essence. Johnny was running full charge up the path. Nobody could see where they were due to the darkness at first. They were inside a tree line, on the path, walking back up to where the cars were. When Johnny and Caleb arrived to where Jake and Steve were, they both saw Steve pulling his hand out of his pocket, but it kept getting stuck, like something was in there. Johnny didn't hesitate. He swung, hitting Steve in the back of the head. The log that he had completely disintegrated on impact. Steve fell down. Johnny fell on top of him. Next thing you know, somebody comes swinging from the right-hand side with the knife. Unfortunately, Steve was stabbed. According to Johnny's account of what happened, blood shot up from Caleb's hand to his elbow, and he said, "Ew, gross." He got up and walked over to the pond, rinsed his hands off, threw the knife into the water, and said, "That's how it's done." Johnny ran over to Caleb, asking him, "What did you do? Why did you do that for?" Then they cleaned up all their stuff, packed it away into the trucks, and left to go back to Johnny's mom's house. The next morning, Jake goes to the Trenton Police Department to report the crime. He writes a statement, stays there for a little bit, writes a second statement, has an interrogation done by the police, and then the cops go look for Johnny, Billy, and Caleb. Now, Billy being a minor, his stepmom brought him in. They questioned him, no problem. Caleb, it took him a while to get there, but his dad finally brought him in. Johnny was arrested. 6 hours. The magical number. The time it took for detectives to solve this homicide. From start to finish. 5 of those were in interrogations. No evidence, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no DNA, and Johnny gets arrested, charged with aggravated murder. Through Johnny's interrogation, he has said all along, "I didn't kill this man. I didn't do this. I don't know why you guys are trying to say that I did."
I did not kill Steve, but I was present the night he got killed. I've been threatened.
Billy's interrogation starts with the police saying, "We've been at this for 25 minutes. Just tell us what we want to hear." So where's the recording of the other 24 minutes? Now, why would the police say that? That's a funny statement to make. Then they tell Billy, "You're facing 15 to life, and your celly's going to make sure that you feel real good for the rest of your life." Why say that to a 16-year-old boy? Especially since he was never charged with any crime. Jake's interrogation is started with, "Just don't tell us you did it, and you're going home." Now that's a real funny statement to make as well. Why would that be said? What were they trying to hide? Caleb's interrogation starts with Caleb saying, "How much time am I facing? What's going to happen to me when I go to court? Does what I did make me a murderer?" And yet, Johnny is arrested. The cops tell Caleb also, "Just don't tell us you did it, and you're going home with Dad tonight." So you have detectives that are telling two of the people that just don't tell us you did it and you're going home, telling the third person that he's facing 15 to life, and then they arrest the fourth person. Why were the other three not charged as accomplices? They were there. They participated. Why weren't they charged? Was there a deal cut? We don't know. The records don't show anything. Now we're at the pre-trial hearing. Under oath, Jake testified that the knife did not belong to Johnny. He never touched it. He never had it. That the knife belonged to Caleb. It was in Caleb's pocket. Caleb pulled it out. Caleb had the knife in his hand. He never dropped the knife. So why was Johnny indicted? Why was Caleb not indicted? It makes no sense to me. Fast forward to September of 2006. Caleb has to do a video deposition because he is supposed to be joining the military. During this deposition, you start to see inconsistencies in his story. In his written statement, he gives this long, drawn-out explanation of how he was over using the bathroom and he turned and saw Johnny hit Steve in the back of the head. Then in his deposition, he says that Johnny had his hand wrapped around Caleb's hand, and the knife was in Caleb's hand, and Johnny drug him over 50 feet, kicking and screaming, and forced him to stab Steve in the neck. During the trial, it's completely different. It's now only 15 feet, and there was no way that there should have been any blood on him at all because Johnny's hand was on top of his. But yet, Johnny didn't have any blood on his hands. Caleb's the only one that had blood on his hands. Caleb's the only one that had blood on his clothes. But yet, Johnny was arrested. Here's where the cracks in the system start to show. You have a written statement by Caleb that says one version of what happened. You have a deposition by Caleb that gives another story altogether. By the time we make it to trial, his story has changed again, to the point that the prosecutor was actually wanting to impeach his own witness for lying on the stand. Now, how is it that that is not reasonable doubt? What if I told you there was more to this story? The state's star witness, Jake, does the same exact thing. His written statement literally states that he turned and looked at me, Johnny, and Billy and said, "That's how you do it, boys." So if Caleb, Johnny, Billy, and Jake were the ones there, and he turned to look at Jake, Johnny, and Billy, who could that be? Who was the one that was guilty? Remember back earlier in the podcast where I told you that during the pre-trial, Jake testified that Johnny never had the knife. Caleb had the knife. Caleb pulled the knife out of his pocket. It was in Caleb's hand. So if that's the case, then why is it that the detectives and the prosecutor focused on Johnny? Another fun fact, during the trial, Jake was actually going to be impeached as well by the prosecution for lying on the stand, for the inconsistencies that were being told that the prosecutor even talked about. When the defense attorney asked for a copy of the written statement because it wasn't supplied during the discovery, the prosecutor didn't want to give it to him. He flat out refused to give it to the defense attorney. He fought with the judge on it. Didn't want the defense attorney to have the written statement. Didn't feel that there was a need for him to have it. Why is that? What is he trying to hide? So here you have a prosecutor who is trying to impeach two of his own witnesses. Why was that not enough to raise reasonable doubt? I'll tell you why. It's pretty simple if you ask me. Because the jury never heard about it. They did this off record. They never told the jury that the prosecutor was having a problem with the witnesses lying. It was never made known to them. So they had no way to know anything about reasonable doubt, because the story that was presented, even though it was all lies, was enough to convince the jury. Here's the problem with that. If you don't have concrete evidence when somebody has committed a crime, how is it that they can be found guilty? Or if you have no evidence at all? Remember, no murder weapon was recovered. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no forensics. They just had the word of these three young kids who ended up lying on the stand and changing their stories multiple times. So when you have a prosecutor that's wanting to impeach his own witnesses for lying, why was the jury not made aware? Because again, at the very least, that would have raised reasonable doubt. It's not up to the defense to prove innocence. All they have to do is raise reasonable doubt. So why wasn't that brought to the attention of the jury? Why weren't they allowed to know about these conversations about impeaching the witnesses? That's enough to have the trial redone. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen. Now, years later, after multiple appeals have been denied, we get to the point where we file a motion for habeas corpus to have the conviction overturned based on new evidence. What is this new evidence? It's simple. The boys' written statements and their interrogation tapes. Those were never turned over in evidence during the discovery. In fact, the prosecutor goes as far as to say that there is no exculpatory evidence. They have nothing that could prove his innocence or his guilt. They've turned all the evidence over. Well, that wasn't true. The truth of the matter is the evidence that they held, the boys' written statements and their interrogations, would have proved Johnny's innocence. It took me 2 years in researching this case and digging deep to find those written statements and those interrogation tapes. Will you be in for a surprise when I tell you how I found them? You see, after going to different police departments and county offices and clerk of courts and everything else, I was told I had all the information involving this case. The problem was, I didn't. Johnny knew those written statements existed. He knew those interrogations existed, but we couldn't find them. So I go to Trenton Police Department and I asked for everything under Johnny Watkins' name. The only thing that was returned to me was his arrest record. So I asked for everything under the victim's name. Wouldn't you know it? There's the written statements. There's the interrogations. Another fun fact, when you are over the age of 18 and you are being questioned, they have to read you your rights, your Miranda rights. Then you have to sign a paper stating that you understand those rights as they have been read to you. That is then time-stamped, dated, and witnessed by the people doing the interrogation. So why is it that Caleb's Miranda rights sheet was dated July 28th at 6:30 in the evening when the crime didn't even happen until July 28th at 11:30, 11:45 at night? So how is it that he signed his Miranda rights 6 hours before the crime ever happened? Why was that not brought up? That's enough to get a case dismissed. That's right, because the prosecutor buried that evidence. And by doing so, they violated Johnny's constitutional rights to a fair trial because they didn't have all the evidence, so they couldn't present it to a jury. Another fun fact, we found out a year ago that the public defender that represented him during the trial was fighting his own case for his law license, which ended up getting suspended the following year. So tell me, exactly how much time did the defense attorney spend to try and prove Johnny's innocence? Did he spend any time at all? Or was he just worried about losing his law license so that all he was focusing on was his own case instead of the life of a person? Because when Johnny was first arrested, he was facing the death penalty. They found him guilty of murder, which is an automatic 15 to life. As more details of the case come to light, questions begin to emerge. Why was Johnny accused with no physical evidence linking him to this crime? Why were alternative suspects not thoroughly investigated? And what role did an implicit bias play in his arrest? When you look at this case, it becomes clear that the investigation was rushed. They focused on a suspect that fit their narrative instead of following the evidence. Next time, we'll delve into the trial that followed, a trial where the odds were stacked against Johnny from the very beginning. How does an innocent man fight back when the system seems determined to convict him? Join us for episode 2 of Wickedly Judged, where we uncover the prosecution's case, the defense's struggles, and the verdict that would change Johnny's life forever. Imagine being in Johnny's shoes, accused of a crime you didn't commit, watching as your freedom slipped away in front of you. For him, this was not hypothetical. It was reality. But Johnny's fight wasn't over. Against all odds, he set out to prove his innocence. Do you know someone who's been wrongfully convicted? Share their story with us. If you or someone you know has experienced a wrongful conviction, or if you are an advocate, attorney, or family member fighting for justice, we'd love to hear from you. Together, we can shine a light on these stories and push for change. Send us a message or email us at wickedlyjudged@gmail.com with details about the case, and let's connect. Help us bring the truth to light. Thank you for listening to Wickedly Judged. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review if this story moved you. Together, we can shine a light on injustice.